In this video, I'm going to talk about memory mapping and predictive coding. These two concepts are part of the way that your brain is able to understand the external environment. When you store memories and retrieve them, when your body moves in space and time, and a lot of the things that happen within your body, even if it has nothing to do with timing, and actually most things in the body has to do with timing. But when it comes to mapping, what that means is your brain has the ability to map out what's happening with your external environment using the sensors that you have. And that could be the 5 sensors, the senses that we know of. And that also includes the touch sensors that we focus on in vibrational chronotherapy. When it comes to knowing where your body is in space, that might have a bearing on how you move, how your muscles move, how far they move, when you pick things up, when you walk, when you talk, the way that you hear things in our environment. So everything that's picked up by our external sensors, our 5, and it's actually 6 senses, if you think about thought as an extra sense. The memory mapping part of it does a couple of different things. If it's a physical mapping of our environment, our neurons actually map themselves out compared to the sensors that are embedded into our skin. And depending on what type of sensors those are, they could be pain type sensors, heat sensors, vibration type sensors, and those could be in our fingertips, in our hands, in our feet. It can be all throughout our body, like the Pacini and corpuscle sensors that we focus on in VCT. The memory mapping part of it really means that in those cases where there's a physical spatial environment, the neurons in the brain actually form themselves in a physical location. It's called a grid. And based off of the distance between those neurons, then the sensors that get activated in your skin, the brain can actually tell with its own 3-dimensional mapping where things are that are being sensed by your external sensors. There are other different types of mappings, but most of them usually have to do with the physical location in your brain for the neurons that receive external sensors, or it could just mean the way that the neurons fire in connection with each other. Like if it's a network of neurons firing at the same time that would recall the same experience that you have in your external environment. That's where predictive coding comes in. Our brain really doesn't have the ability to respond certain ways when certain threats happen to us in our external environment. We have a backup system or a predictive system. What this means is your brain attempts to capture as much information about its external environment because the brain really cannot see what's happening on the outside world. So our brain uses these senses and it all comes back up to the brain. There are some things like reflex actions that do not use brain neurons in order to accomplish, like if you touch a hot stove and you withdraw your arm really fast. That doesn't necessarily mean that your brain was part of that response. But in most responses, whether it is the behavioral actions that respond to certain things that are happening in the moment, when you see things, hear things, smell different smells, all the things that make up the environment at a particular event in your life, all of those things are captured, but most likely those things have been captured at some point in your life. When you're a child and you start to understand your external environment, this is where most of your predictive coding is captured within your brain. This is where neural networks are formed. Neurons are wired together and fire together. And this is part of your predictive coding. Predictive means that you are mapping things out already the first time you experience something in your external environment. And again, that's using all 5 to 6 of our senses. Then your brain has a way to anticipate certain events. And when we are triggered by external sensing, again, at some future point, that predictive coding, hopefully that predictive coding is the same exact thing that you experienced the first time that you established the coding. What this means is we have the tendency to be surprised. This has, on one end of the spectrum, surprise is, oh, I didn't expect that to happen. On the other end of that spectrum is trauma. Most of our really, really bad traumas have to do with what's called prediction error. They are surprises that are different from the predictive coding that we have established within our brain. We think we know what's supposed to happen, and when a certain event that is similar to what we expected does not produce the same exact outcome, then we're surprised. This is called prediction error, and this is a term that we're going to use quite often in our training, because what prediction error really means is it's trauma. It's things that happen within your brain, and we actually can connect that to our ego. The ego that we create in ourselves, where we react in different ways than we should, behavioral things, emotional reactions, mental memory and inability to recall certain memories. Those are all things that are part of trauma. And the greater the trauma, the greater the prediction error. So on the picture on the screen, what you're seeing is, over on the left, a box called predictive coding. And again, this is something that usually gets built at a very, very early age. And that's why most people, when they try to understand their current environment, they try to go back all the way to the earliest building of our predictive coding during our early childhood. After a certain age, most of the things that happen in our environment we've already experienced, or we've experienced the primary understanding of those environments, even if it's been told to us or we see them on TV. This is all building your predictive coding expectation of the world around you. When it comes to something happening in current events where you respond in a way that would be inappropriate or doesn't necessarily match how we would expect people to act in a certain way, it's our predictive error happens, and we try to stabilize our memory and understand, reconciliate, have some sort of understanding of why we have a different experience than what we expected. And again, the greater that error, that prediction error is, the greater the trauma is. What happens when a prediction error occurs is there's some sort of reconciliation, or there's some sort of attempt to understand why there was a difference. We process our prediction errors. This is also known in the ascension training and the ascension understanding as processing your ego. Our ego in certain behaviors and emotions are all built upon a prediction error. Then, as we try to process prediction errors, we actually have to process them in layers. And if we start out with a lower hierarchy of understanding, that maybe it is it's something that would be obvious that, okay, this type of thing happens to a lot of people, and it just happened to happen to me, like a fender bender when you're in your car. You may have been sideswiped or just bumped a smaller car accident. And those are things that are understandable because most people have them. course, it doesn't mean that we might not have a meltdown over what had just happened, especially depending on the circumstances. But again, those are all things that you built in your predictive coding on how bad a fender bender is to you. Now, moving up higher hierarchies is something even worse. Like maybe you had a pet in that gets hit by a car. Those are things that are even a higher hierarchy of prediction errors than just having a fender bender. Now you've lost an animal that is very close to you, and that can be a little bit of higher understanding that, you know, most people that have pets have an understanding or prediction coding that we may lose our pets before we pass away. So that's something that most of us had gone through if we've had pets in our lives. Now, it's most likely that you can reconcile that, but as you move further up the hierarchy, it might be that a spouse had died in a car accident or been hit by a car. And that would be another higher form of hierarchy, because now you have to process the fact that you just lost your spouse. But it's more likely that you would lose a spouse than lose a child. And you can see that as you keep moving up these hierarchy ladders, it is a hierarchy of processing of prediction errors that you created yourself. And you have to be able to understand and process why these things happen and make sense of them in order to process your prediction errors. This is where people get stuck into traumatic stress disorders, because these prediction errors are unable to be processed. So what happens is the prediction error stays, you try, and there's no change. Then you try to alter or update the memory, or if it's a weak memory that is different from the prediction coding, it just kind of goes away eventually. So there is the possibility that we stay caught in this loop between what you think your environment, or think of your external environment, your prediction coding, the expectation of what happens in the world around you, and then as things happen, you constantly refer back to your expectations, and the further away they are, that's prediction error. And larger prediction errors, like losing a child very early or in a very traumatic way that we saw and had maybe experienced firsthand, those things are cannot possibly in our lifetime be reconciled or understood, or a way to process that prediction error. So the reason why these things are very important is, first, in order to process certain things, we need a clear mind in order to do that. In the training that we've developed at NHC Academy, we try to strip away those things that are blocking your predictive coding and your ability to process prediction errors. We do feel that prediction errors, how large they are, has a lot to do with your ego and what would be considered dropping your ego. That would be processing very, very bad traumas. We're more likely to, as we go through life, to understand, okay, this sort of thing happens, you know, more often than I expected. That would be processing a lower level prediction error. But the traumas that stay, those that have been over in war at some point, those have been in a car accident or lost a loved one that they couldn't possibly understand why, and keep questioning that. They get caught in a prediction error loop. And this changes the way we behave. This changes the way we think. Trauma can also cause memory loss, because prediction errors change the timing. When we have stressful environments, those memories are actually stored in different timing because we actually go through shock. And when the timing is off in memory processing or you know, remembering something, then the ability to retrieve it, you have to be able to take those particular things that you remembered and associate them through neurons to other events and other things that happen. So if the expectations are spread across different external sensors, sometimes you act or think differently. That might be hearing a particular noise that reminds you of an event where your prediction coding where your prediction error was quite great and you had some sort of trauma. That's why if you're keep in mind that your external sensors are actually the things that update the brain. And if we could start to strip away some of those sensors, like during our vibrational chronotherapy full body calibration, what we do there is we're taking advantage of the ability for vibrotactile sensors like the Pacinian corpuscles. We can actually get several of them to turn off, so we have less and less external senses as we try to process what's going on in our brain. This is why once we get to about the second or third tuning fork, something starts to happen within the brain of our clients, and they start having these memories that may be all the way back to being a very young baby. And a lot of times the connection isn't made right then when they recall well, it seems like a dream while they're having a VCT session. But this memory, this vision that they had, a lot of times we find that those are visions of maybe a mother that was holding you as a baby, and you see your mother's face, but it's the face of your mother when you were a baby. And this is a constant feedback we see with VCT. So we feel that when you start to synchronize, and in the case of our full body calibration for VCT, you start to shut down some of the external sensors and in something called lateral inhibition. And that will allow your brain to start processing things. We tend to process prediction errors when we go to sleep. And sleep, in some phases of sleep, would be considered more meditative. So if you can use tuning forks or some other method to help a person get into a more focused meditative state, which could be the same as processing through dreams, when they're in a certain meditative state, they can also remember the things that happen, where we have a hard time with dreams and interpreting dreams. When we come back into a certain cognitive state, we start to process those things just like we process prediction errors while we're awake and conscious. We use all of our predictive coding of our awake self in our awake consciousness to try to understand and make sense and process the traumas that we have in life. That's why dreams try to process when you're in that dream state. And that's why in these forms of healing, where we become meditative, even in VCT, that gives us a better chance of processing. And really processing could mean, in some cases, just seeing the event or changing your predictive coding by seeing it from a different angle, from a different perspective. If it's a certain person that has done something traumatic to you, sometimes, and this has been something that's come up in psychological therapeutic sessions before, where you try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. This doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to forgive a person for doing something traumatic. What it means is that your prediction error, when you try to process those things, you're trying to understand it from a standpoint where you didn't before. Predictive coding, if it was coded correctly at the beginning, where we all had compassion and understanding as a child, and sometimes it would be better to process it as how a child would think. That's where most of our predictive coding happens. Then through programming throughout most of your childhood into adulthood, we start to change some of our predictive coding as prediction errors start to change over and over and over again. Now our predictive coding becomes a little more negative. We build up this ego that is prediction errors happening more and more and more. And it's that prediction error that ends up being the processing of, that ends up being our behavior itself. Overall, our ego turns into behavior. And the outward expression of those behaviors ends up showing emotions as well associated to our ego. So that's memory mapping and predictive coding.